Good evening and welcome to Money Matters. My name is Charlie Huntington. I'm a board member and co-founder of BioStrategy Partners. BioStrategy Partners is a not-for-profit, and we're focused on helping young pre-seed life science companies to grow not only their good science but their good business. Tonight we continue our special life science series, but before we do so, I want to remind our viewers from time to time financial issues relating to life science or healthcare matters or companies may be discussed on this show. These discussions are not and should not be viewed as financial advice. Moreover, since this program is pre-recorded and shown at a later date, please keep in mind that the information may be dated. You should always check with your financial advisor before entering into any financial transaction. I'm very pleased tonight to have with me as my co-host Mike Verrill. Mike runs the business development function for all of Fesnac and Associates, each of their business units, which include accounting, financial management solutions, tax services, transaction advisory services, valuation, litigation support, and bankruptcy and restructuring. Good evening, Mike.
Hi, Charlie. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks.
Thanks for having me on.
As usual, funding is a challenge for many of our clients. I believe it as a challenge in the environment in general. Can you tell us a little bit about funding and maybe some recent successes that some of Fesnac's clients have had, and what are you seeing?
Sure, Charlie. That's a great question. As we focus on many companies in the life sciences space, I'm sure they would all agree that funding for new technology is always difficult. But we are seeing some successes, particularly companies focused on medical device, a few companies that we're working with that have new technology for drug delivery based on old compounds, and also some generics are having some success from investors.
Okay. Are the successes coming in the forms of grants, or this is private money that they've raised from venture capital community?
Yeah, we're seeing private investors, not grants, but private investment from venture capital type organizations.
Okay. Very good. Before I introduce tonight's special guest, I want to remind our viewers that if they have a question, they could mail their question to be answered on future Money Matters episodes to Money Matters, 205 East Levering Mill Road, Bala Cynwyd, Pennsylvania, 19004, or they could email their questions to moneymatterstv@gmail.com. It's with great pleasure that I welcome tonight's special guest, Dr. Andrew Reaume. Dr. Reaume is president and CEO of Melior Discovery, a biotechnology firm which concentrates on repurposing drugs. He was previously a senior business analyst at Pfizer in the Department of Genomics and Proteomic Services, if I'm saying that correctly.
Proteomic Sciences. Yeah.
Thank you. From 1993 to 1999, Andrew worked as a research scientist at Cephalon. He has an MBA from the Wharton School, and he has his PhD in genetics from the University of Connecticut. Welcome.
Thanks, Charlie. It's good to be here.
Thank you.
Andrew, we were always interested in the personal side of your career choices, but what initially attracted you to a career in the industry?
Well, I'd have to say, a lot of it has to do with a natural interest and innate curiosity I've always had in the sciences. But when I look back at sort of the path, the sort of stepwise path I've taken over the years, initially, for example, when I started in university, I was directed towards marine biology. From there, I went to evolved my focus to basic genetics, and from there, applied that to my early career path in biotechnology industry. So when I look back after sort of all this sort of stepwise migration, I have to say, yes, it was the sort of that natural curiosity in science, but increasingly, and I wasn't quite aware at the time, but in retrospect, sort of this desire to, at the same time, have sort of a direct and tangible impact on people and in the world in general. So it's the coupling of those two things.
Andrew, can you share with our viewers a little about Melior Discovery?
Sure. So Melior Discovery is a company that I co-founded in 2005 with a colleague, Mike Saporito, and it was largely inspired through know-how that I had acquired through an initiative that I'd spearheaded while at Pfizer, where I was previously. But in a nutshell, just to cut to the chase, Melior is a company with a core mission around drug repositioning. That is, finding new uses for existing drugs, or most particularly, this may be discontinued drug candidates that made it up through clinical stage, but were discontinued because they didn't have enough efficacy for the indication they were pursued for. So that's drug repositioning, but more particularly still, and what really differentiates the company is the way that we find new uses for existing drugs. And in brief, this is essentially what could be described as platform technology. We've coined it TheraTrace, but in a nutshell, it involves taking a candidate and systematically evaluating it through a very broad array of animal models of disease as a way to uncover what would otherwise be unpredicted alternative uses for that compound. That endeavor of evaluating in so many animal models normally would be quite impractical, the amount of work and time and so on that it would take. And that's where the know-how that we've applied comes in. That's what is sort of embedded within this, as we refer to, a platform technology that we've coined TheraTrace. Just a couple words on the business model. So we take that capability I just described for you, and on the one hand, we direct that to ourselves. So we're building our own pipeline. We have a therapeutic pipeline of assets that we're developing, bringing into the clinic. And then secondly, in addition to all that, taking that capability and using it, leveraging it to form partnerships. Partnerships with, particularly with pharma companies, but also other biopharmaceutical companies, bringing in revenue. So while we are venture-backed, we are trying to do this in a capital-efficient way through the revenues that we're bringing in through these partnerships.
And you have a current candidate for diabetes. Can you talk about that?
Sure. In fact, that's a great compound, that molecule serves to really illustrate the attributes of the approach that we take. So again, make a very long story brief. This compound that we refer to as MLR-1023 was a molecule that was brought up through mid-stage clinical trials for gastric ulcer by Pfizer in the late 1970s. It was discontinued in those clinical trials because it didn't have sufficient efficacy towards gastric ulcer, but it was otherwise quite safe as far as they could tell and well tolerated in those clinical trials. So we took that and evaluated it as we do, as I described in the platform that we have. And what emerged was activity that had never been previously described in models of metabolic disease, and particularly diabetes. And continuing on, make a very long story short, where we are with that now today is having sort of fully described all features of this. What we now know that we have is a therapeutic candidate that sort of fits the bill of what many experts in the field would sort of describe as a holy grail within diabetes. What I'm referring to by that is this is an insulin sensitizer, but it works through a mechanism very distinct from any pre-existing insulin sensitizers. Prior to this, all insulin sensitizers, which, by the way, were an important therapeutic category for diabetes, that category has largely disappeared with the disappearance of a number of drugs that were on the market. There's one that's still on the market, but it's got some significant liabilities. So that's what I mean. It's all but disappeared. And so in that regard, experts would say that the field of diabetes is moving backwards. And what we really need is an insulin sensitizer that works through a different mechanism. It doesn't have the liabilities that were associated with that category. And by that I'm referring to, people may have heard of Avandia or rosiglitazone, that class of drugs. And so we have the insulin sensitizing qualities of that, but as best we can tell, there's no indication it has the liabilities associated with that, the type of insulin sensitized represented by Avandia. Now, let me just say one more thing, which was, I said earlier that this served to illustrate the attributes of our approach very well. And what I mean by that are two things. One, that even in a field so well studied, so thoroughly covered as diabetes, this approach that we've taking a compound and in an unbiased fashion, evaluating it across all these animal models without sort of biases of mechanism and forethought of that nature, was able to uncover a mechanism that is novel to diabetes that had otherwise not been picked up through the conventional research strategies. So that's one important point. And the other important point is that by virtue of this being a repositioning story, that is, we took a clinical candidate, repositioned it, we were able to go back and we have the clinical, what is referred to as the dossier, that full package of clinical data that was collected by Pfizer. And from the appendices, from all the sort of the research archives that are part of that, we're able to go in and look at the clinical chemistry they did. Within the clinical chemistry is blood glucose, and there it was. No one had ever appreciated it, but there was statistically significant blood glucose lowering. In fact, fortuitously, in the gastric ulcer trial itself, there were 4 diabetics that were treated with our compound, and in those patients, we had very profound blood glucose lowering indicated from that blood chemistry data.
Congratulations.
Yeah, it's excellent.
Thanks.
You and Melior have received the prestigious Michael J. Fox grant.
Correct.
Extremely difficult to get. Congratulations on that. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about that?
Sure. So very briefly, this was towards a compound which, just to give you a little bit of background on that, it's a molecule that is currently approved in a very restricted market. It's still early stage, so I'm going to be just a little bit obtuse about some of the details. Mm-hmm. But it is approved in a restricted market. It's not on the U.S. market. It's not any of the other major markets for a psychiatric indication. We took that compound, evaluated as we do, and what we uncovered was quite convincing activity in a model of Parkinson's disease, but more specifically what we're seeing is protection against what is referred to as L-DOPA-induced dyskinesia. And just to give you a little what that all means, when people see Parkinson's patients, people often, for example, Michael J. Fox themselves, and they see these sort of erratic movements, what you're seeing in patients of that sort isn't the effect of Parkinson's directly. What you're actually observing with those patients is actually a drug side effect. That's the L-DOPA-induced dyskinesia, and that's something that we have uncovered that this compound that we're working with blocks. So what's particularly interesting, and so to your question then about the Michael J. Fox support, then they provide support for us to further characterize that and to more fully flesh out that story. But what's particularly exciting about this too is by virtue of the fact that it's already on the market in a very restricted region, it really lowers the threshold or makes it much easier for us to establish very early human proof of concept. We can go into that market and do very early studies in that country and as sort of a near next step of how we would progress. So really,
I think it'd be a great validator and would have some potential money sources lining up to co-invest, or I know Mike's got a question that will cover that, but I would think that you would have people who want to get in your jet stream just based on that grant.
I think that's a fair statement, and we're always looking to raise money. We've got a lot of therapeutic area opportunities, so we're always shopping to raise money. So, but yes, I concur.
Yeah. So I did talk a little bit about the funding in the beginning. You're not working on one therapeutic discovery. You've got multiple. How does that story work? What success have you had when you're going out and talking to funding sources?
I mean, in terms of funding sources, I think this is one of the things I sort of alluded to earlier that makes us different. I mentioned that we have funding from we're venture backed. We also have funding from partnerships, and by virtue of we talked about Michael J. Fox, so we also have grant money coming in. You were also talking earlier about the environment we're in, and certainly we would concur that these are challenging times. We see challenges on all those fronts to a certain degree. Venture, for example, has been impacted by the financial crisis we've come through. There's fewer VCs doing later stage deals in this current environment. On the partnership side, clearly it's most people recognize that pharma has been slashing research budgets, offshoring to an extent that they never have previously. So those combined effects impact the sort of partnerships that we would do with them otherwise. And on the funding side, at least at the federal funding level, the latest we're seeing is people are aware of what's going on with the sequester, so it's budget issues like that have pressures on funding. But I think I would say we are nothing if we are not creative and innovative in terms of our approach towards financing. And by having this sort of multi-pronged approach, I'm happy to say we've emerged through what has been very challenging times, and moreover, we would also concur what I think I heard you saying, which is things are starting to swing back. So we're looking for sort of a brighter and brighter 2013, 2014 going forward.
Things that are closer to approval, it seems like the funding is interested in jumping on board there.
Yeah, and in terms of how we fund these various asset opportunities, it's sort of a case by case. We are have started a business, an aspect of our business model where we're spinning these assets off into separate entities that are ripe for independent financing, independent management, independent exits for investors, than sort of the mothership, if you will. So
the old-fashioned model doesn't work, so you got to reinvent it and make it work, right?
That's exactly right.
Great.
And you're likely, I'm sure, to attract investments in those various sleeves that you might not have attracted for the entire thing.
That's exactly right.
Let me ask you a question. I understand that you've successfully partnered with probably half of the world's largest pharma companies. Can you tell us a little bit about what those successes have meant and about the partnerships?
Right. So to your point, we've done partnerships with Pfizer, AstraZeneca, J&J, Abbott, Boehringer Ingelheim. There's probably someone I've left out, but those particular partnerships were all sort of geared around the core competence that I referred to earlier, which is, to use the parlance that we use, a phenotypic screen, using this platform technology we have to evaluate compounds of potential using these capabilities that we have. A couple words I'd say in terms of the successes we've had. I have to be a little bit muted because the details, we can't describe too much detail on how those have gone. But I will say that most of those partnerships that I mentioned have started off with some sort of a pilot program, and every pilot program we've ever initiated have always progressed to a sort of a full-term, full-bore partnership. Moreover, there have been very tangible successes that I could only summarize by saying that there have been more than one example that we're aware of, and we're not aware of the full extent of what companies sometimes run with and how they progress with with data that we provide them. But what we do know is at least a couple of instances where there have been what we refer to as clinical restarts. Programs that had died were going to be left for abandoned that were restarted because of data and new activity that we revealed around a candidate.
That's great. So it's a symbiotic relationship where they really depend on you and your expertise to help them reinvigorate some assets where maybe they spent some money up front.
Yeah, no, I think we'd like to believe it's money very well spent.
Yeah.
And I would think by the same token, they could kill those things that much earlier, right, than continue to pour assets into them if it makes sense, if what you guys discover, it makes sense not to continue developing that.
Right. So far, the way, in sort of the brief coverage we've had, we've described this as something where we come in after something has failed. Increasingly, these relationships that we're having, particularly with pharma, are at an earlier stage before something has died. It may be late stage preclinical, and we're brought in to describe full potential of something that may be going in for a particular indication, but if there are alternatives, they want to know as soon as possible. What it allows companies, sponsors, the pharma companies to do is sort of form hypotheses that we help generate for them, that they can then use to sort of augment their clinical trial design and in some way or another test these ideas alongside of the clinical trial that they're going to be running, that the compound is primarily intended for.
Thank you.
Many of our guests sitting right here in the very seat that you're in have talked about the frustrations and challenges in dealing with the FDA. I have had some indication from some folks that maybe things are getting a little better from a regulatory standpoint. What do you see? What's the environment, one? And two, if it's still a difficult environment, what can we change, or what policies can we look at as a country to bring good drugs to market quicker so that sick people can get healthy?
Right, so that's a big topic. And you use the word challenging. Maybe maybe I'd be a little bit more provocative in this context and maybe describe it as even I'd go so far as to say broken. What your viewers who aren't fully immersed in this industry would have a hard time maybe fully appreciating is the amount of money and the amount of time and the amount of expertise that is poured into every drug that ultimately, for those that do make it to market, that behind every one of those drugs that make it to market, there are many, many, many more candidates that have failed. So it's very high risk. And for those that do succeed, the direct costs for those drugs alone are staggering. So
staggering meaning billion plus.
Certainly pushing towards the $1 billion mark. The fully weighted cost, when you factor in attrition, is many billions. There have been estimates to and upwards of even $4 billion. And again, that's
when you combine the losers with the winner.
Exactly.
Okay.
But even the direct costs for those that do make it is pushing towards, in some cases, for a chronic indication, something like diabetes, will be pushing in the neighborhood of $1 billion. Now, to bring this back to the topic of the regulatory environment, what I believe, what is surprising to me is sort of where the process is when you consider the time, the money, the expertise, and then what it ultimately culminates in, the sort of approval process to get these programs with all that investment over the market. And there's a great, and I can't go into the details, but if there's rich data to discuss this topic around two recent events. Just within the last, I would say 6 weeks or so, last couple months, the first part of this year, there were two drugs that came through the regulatory process. One was dapagliflozin by Janssen, and the other one was Gliflozin by BMS AstraZeneca. One of those received approval. One of those received a complete response letter, which was essentially FDA rejection. Those are very similar drugs, very similar mechanism of action. When you look at sort of the particulars around the advisory board process around there, you can't help but come away with a notion that the process is very imperfect. That you can't help but ask questions about the sort of the qualifications of those few individuals that are making these huge decisions on whether something is approved or not.
Do you think we have bureaucrats running this, or do you think we have company people running it? Who's running the process?
It's bureaucrats within the agency. The one thing I just add to all of this, so that wouldn't be immediately appreciated again by those who aren't close to this, is it's not just, so when we're talking about whether or not one of these gets approved, it's not just the effects that are so obvious to that a drug didn't get approved and the tragic effects for the patients, the effects for the sponsor who invested nearly $1 billion, but the multiplier, the follow-on. For example, I mean, we feel it very directly because it completely alters the sort of tenor of discussion that we could have with one of those companies when we bring a diabetes product to them to talk about a licensing arrangement. The tenor of the discussion that we would have today versus the tenor of the discussion in 2007 as a result of the regulatory environment we are in today is completely different.
Much more risk adverse.
And so we're just one small company in all this. This sort of process is being repeated thousands of times over with many other companies, and that's sort of the multiplier effect that is going to have lasting implications.
So is inconsistency one significant characteristic of the FDA that frustrates most people when dealing with them?
It's inconsistency. I think that we could start with reassessing the risk-benefit analysis that goes into drug approval. I mean, we have to accept that drugs, at some level, and there was a famous toxicologist once said that the poison's in the dose, and so let's just accept that all drugs have liabilities, but they also have benefits, and this is a very fundamental issue. But the risk-benefit analysis in the regulatory environment now is very different than where it was even 5 years ago.
Andrew, we've got about a minute left,
okay.
Maybe less,
okay.
And I want to just make one statement, okay, which you corrected me on, and I okay. want you really to tell our viewers what okay. that is. And I said it's been said that 20% of the United States gross domestic product is healthcare. Do you believe this figure, and do you believe that pharma is a large part of the problem? In 10 seconds, can you basically lay it out for our viewers what's correct about that statement and what's incorrect?
The statement is correct. 20% is healthcare. 10% of all of healthcare is pharmaceuticals, but it's not the problem. So to the extent that healthcare is a hot-button issue, there's so much more to talk about than pharmaceuticals. And I would even argue the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturing Association, have made a very compelling case that, if anything, pharmaceuticals actually can help manage costs.
So it's reimbursements, it's things like that.
Keeping patients out of hospitals, which is what pharmaceuticals can do, is the way in which pharmaceuticals can reduce our total health care burden.
Andrew, you've done a great job tonight. We have enough material where we could do a second show easily. Mike, thank you very much for the expertise that you brought to this tonight. I want to remind our viewers that our guest next week will be Steve Tallis. Steve is with Polysolution Advisors, LLC. And I want to remind our viewers, as always, that their money does matter to us, and we'll see you next week.